are the filter, and you are, as you say, the set designer and director of your comic books.
On some level, I think it's a fair criticism. I think a lot of people expect, if you're going to call something journalistic, that it's going to be strictly objective. Objective, because I studied journalism, meaning taking yourself out of the equation, presenting both sides of the story. But I've always felt that, I have a brain and I'd like to use it, and maybe there are two sides of a story, but maybe one side should have a bit more weight than the other side, considering what's going on. I mean, when I go to a place, I'm looking to see what's going on, and I'll make judgments about it. Now, so I don't promise strict objectivity. What I do promise is honesty, and that is, if I'm seeing something that, let's say I'm sympathetic to the Palestinians, or to some of their historical grievances. If Palestinians are saying something to me that I feel like, oh, this is going to look pretty bad if an American reads this, if I hear it a number of times, I feel, okay, if this is something I'm hearing, then I need to put this in the book. It doesn't matter if it helps or hurts. This is truthful. That's what I mean by being honest. So what I can promise you is I never make angels of the victims, because victims aren't often angels. In fact, they can behave in a brutal way because they've been brutalized themselves.
You gave a talk at Reading Frenzy in 2003. I think it was upon the release of The Fixer. And one of the things that really stuck with me from that talk was the mud.
Okay.
Do you remember what I'm talking about?
I do. I think it was about the Gaza book, maybe.
Well, you were giving a slideshow.
Oh, and then I talked about it.
It was for The Fixer,
All right,
but you gave a slideshow. You used mud as an example of the unique ability to convey certain aspects of a story through comics that don't really exist in other mediums. And I was hoping you could kind of expound on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think every media has its strength. Every media has something that, it has its potential. And like a photojournalist, to me, a good photojournalist can sum up a situation really well with one photograph. I mean, that's the strength of it. It's like an editorial cartoonist. One image and one line are giving you it's almost like a slam, and it's like a whole opinionated piece in one sharp burst. And with comics, I think the power of them are the repeated imagery. For example, that example was the mud in refugee camps of Gaza. And I thought, if a prose writer would be writing about mud, how awful the conditions are in the streets, they're going to maybe mention it once. They're not going to keep interrupting the flow of their narrative to say, and again, there was a lot of mud. You're not going to see that reminder every few lines. However, in a comic book, because of repeated imagery, you can have that mud in every background, so that it does follow the reader around in the same way it followed me around when I was there, and it will sink into the subconscious. It's not even a question of bringing it up. It's there over and over and over again. It's like the amount of kids that are following you around. You might mention it once, but how often are you going to mention it if you're a prose writer? But in comics, you can just show kids sort of butting into the frame.
The desire to create comics, to tell a story through sequential art, is a very particular artistic instinct. And it's also one of the most labor-intensive methods you could choose. So I don't believe that you've stuck with the medium simply because you couldn't do the kind of hard-hitting journalism that you wanted to do. I mean, you must have either had or at some point developed this overriding impulse to tell your stories in words and pictures.
Right, well, I mean, I was doing comics since I was about 6 years old. And I think the impulse is, there are two impulses when you're into comics when you're that young and you're actually creating them. And one is you like to draw, and one is you like to tell stories. You like a narrative. And there are very few drawings I did over the course of my life, really, but especially as a kid, that are just sort of standalone drawings of something like an airplane or something like that, there was almost always a story to go with it, because that's just how I thought. And so, to me, it's just part of who I am. There was a time when I wanted to be a writer as far as journalism goes, and if it had worked out, I probably would have done that. I would have been just a regular journalist. In some ways, I'm glad that didn't pan out, because it made me fall back on comics, which led me back to journalism through another door. And I'm not sure I would be a good writer now, because now my brain is always thinking in terms of comics. So when something happens around me, I'm immediately sort of putting it into frames, a little story somehow, even a conversation I'm having. I'm thinking of it as a comic story, not as something to, a paragraph I'm going to write for my next book.
I've started thinking in Facebook updates. Something Joe knows nothing about.
I don't actually, so.
So a few years ago, Marjane Satrapi came to Portland, an artist that you actually introduced me to, her work to me. And during her talk, she mentioned how when she started doing comics, her friends and family would ask her when she was going to write a real book. And then when the animated film of her book, Persepolis, came out, those same people were, well, why didn't they make a real movie out of your fake book? That was a number of years ago at this point. Do you feel, I see a greater appreciation, but I have a very specific perspective. Do you sense in the outside world, outside of our kind of industry, that there is a growing appreciation or understanding of the legitimacy and importance of comics as an art form and, in your case, as a form of reportage?
I think there has been, especially, I think for the mainstream, especially since about the year 2000. I think for some reason in my own head, that's when it coalesced. I think there was just a lot of good work coming out, and by that point, a lot of young people who were younger in the 80s, who appreciated books like Love and Rockets and all that sort of stuff, had taken editorial positions in magazines, and they could now say, no, I'm going to feature this and have someone review this, because I liked it when I was coming of age, and now I still like it. So that was going on. But I definitely think something's changed, because, here's the Portland Art Museum with every single page of Robert Crumb's Genesis, and that really says something. And in my own case, I think people do take my work seriously. Obviously not everyone does. Some people say, how can you possibly write about that in comics form? But you hear that less. And I think people see it seriously. And, now magazines will contact me or my agent to do work, journalism work. So it shows that there has been a shift. Because there was a time when it was really difficult to get someone interested. When I was going to Bosnia, I stopped in New York for about a month, basically because I thought, okay, I've done this Palestine series. That shows that I can do this, and now I'd like a magazine to send me to Bosnia, like fund me, give me press credentials. There was no way. The younger editors liked it, but it was always shot down. And this was in 1995. Still no one was taking it that seriously. But I think by around the turn of the century, suddenly doors began to open.
It seems to me that there'd be some challenges, though, for you to do reporting on current events for magazines, because the whole process is so time-consuming. You go to the location, you do your research, take your photographs, you come back, you write the piece, and then you illustrate it. Like, what's a kind of typical time frame?
Well, that's true. There are always the frustrations of feeling like you want to get something out now. Because I studied journalism, the getting it out now was always sort of in my head. I've learned to sort of pull back and say, maybe your techniques, I'm talking to myself here, your techniques are journalistic, but this is going to maybe appear 5 years down the road, and it's going to be a snapshot of what's going on now. But there are some truths that remain. For example, the Palestine book, there's still things going on in the occupied territories that the book is still right about, that not enough has changed to say it's completely out of date. The Bosnia book is more like a history book now. But I do stuff for magazines. For example, I was in India, and I'm doing something on poverty in rural areas. Now that's not going away between my going there and the time it sees print in a couple of months. That's going to be with us. So there are some things that I've learned to sort of approach the universal subjects or the universal points in a subject. And I've learned that there are some things I'm interested in that are just going to be around for a while.